The strange thing about propaganda is that the word rarely gets to have value when used about something happening right in front of our eyes. Such is the power of the phenomenon. Even if you start to suspect that something that a lot of people are saying may not be true, or may even be a deliberate lie, it's hard to get a grip on the facts and sometimes even the unbiased attention of people. But then there is one antidote to propaganda, and that is time. With time, and when we look back from a distance, it's almost always clear that something that everybody said was the truth was in fact not only a lie, but actually a case of propaganda. If you pick up any academic book on the history of propaganda, you'll find a lot of examples from the past about how governments, the military, advertisers used deliberate, well-organized campaigns of persuasion to achieve some goal, usually a war. During World War I, the way in which the United States was instigated into hating on its German citizens and eventually joining the war in Europe is a great example of propaganda. British intelligence agencies and other vested interests did all they could to mobilize opinion and soldiers for a war that Americans really had no stake in at all. Similarly, in the early months of 2003, virtually every political leader in the United States and every major news media platform went along with the claim that Iraq posed an existential threat to America because they had weapons of mass destruction. Soon, it became clear that it had all been a lie. But then the damage was done, to Iraqis and to many Americans too. And let's face it, the propaganda campaigns in America still haven't ended. It is just that it's not yet time for society at large to face them. But my thoughts today are not about propaganda in America, but about what I think was a watershed moment in the phenomenon of propaganda in India. This moment happened, I think, in December 2019. Something burst in our minds, our lives, and most importantly, our relationships back then, and it has never really healed. December 2019 was the moment that reality split in two for us. Not as much as it has in America, but a major change for us all the same. We might have had political differences in India before, but what unfolded with the announcement of the Citizenship Amendment Act, or the CAA, was a set of events which social scientists and historians, and maybe family counselors and therapists too, will all have to one day think carefully about. Very simply, the possibility of debate and something like polite disagreement between people disappeared in those intense weeks between the passing of the CAA and the aftermath of the violence that took place in Delhi in early 2020. In the angry words that exploded on screens everywhere, WhatsApp, Facebook, Twitter, there was no attempt to regulate or adjust one's beliefs in relation to the words of others. There was no sense of value given to listening, learning, adjusting, and at best disagreeing and moving on. This degree of separation or polarization, where people are not just disagreeing on the interpretation but on the fundamental reality of a situation itself, was already running wild in American politics. By 2016, it was clear that many Americans simply could not fathom how their elders, neighbors, or fellow citizens could have voted for Donald Trump. They wouldn't have felt that way with any other Republican perhaps, but with Trump, something happened. It was hard for them to explain what it was though. If you asked them, and they didn't get wildly angry with you for even asking, they would say, sometimes intelligently, sometimes not, something about Putin, white supremacy, Nazis, and expect you to show you also knew how all of this was, and it was, of course, very, very disgusting. It was a phenomenon that few could both be in and out of at the same time. George Bush had infamously said about the Iraq war that you were with us or against us. Something like that happened in America around Donald Trump's time. The possibility of the middle was gone. Around that time, the cartoonist and persuasion expert Scott Adams wrote about it in his book Win Bigly. He said it was like two different movies were playing on the same screen. When you think about this as a sociological phenomenon, it's hard not to resist the comparisons to hypnosis. Millions of people start to see one name, one face, but then what they imagine beyond that gets split in two completely opposite directions. And then, of course, those two directions take over people's minds, or at least their typing fingers, and then we all go to war with each other. Now, the strange thing about Indian society is that perhaps because of our inevitably complex and prolific diversity, we used to exist quite comfortably with the idea that everyone around us probably thinks differently than we do, and that is just fine. Maybe it's because we used to be, and we still are, a polytheistic civilization. Or maybe it's because we've had many more political parties, leaders, and ideologies at play in our democracy than in American politics. When I was a child, we used to have people in the same family who could worship Indira Gandhi or dislike her vehemently. Similarly, even in the early years of Prime Minister Modi's government, we were still handling our differences, if not with grace, at least something like a just adjust policy. But that was only until December 2019. When the Citizenship Amendment Act was passed, something exploded in people's minds. That explosion was so sudden, so sharp, and so psychologically permanent, the old just adjust system simply collapsed. On social media, people somehow went beyond ignoring or mildly arguing with opponents to doing something completely demonstrative with a deadly finality. In a WhatsApp group of some of my old school friends, for example, people used to share articles from different news sources, some of them critical of the Modi government and some appreciative. We mostly ignored what we disagreed with or argued lightheartedly and moved on. But with CAA, something else happened. Some of my friends began to cry out in what sounded like absolute terror and disbelief, not just about the CIA, but about the rest of us who were not screaming against it like they were. Confronted with such strong words and emotions, I could see that many of us really did not know what to say for the moral crime of failing to condemn Prime Minister Modi. History will remember, the world will not forget. You, dear friend, classmate, family member, are exactly like the German citizens in the 1930s who kept silent when their Jewish neighbors were being targeted. Yes, that reference was made too. Naturally, I had to do the work, if only to understand the facts for myself. What exactly was the CAA that we were now being called fascists for? It turned out the CAA had nothing to do with the citizenship rights of any existing Indian citizen, Hindu or Muslim. It was quite simply a refugee bill aimed at helping a small group of people, refugees from minority religious communities in South Asia, who had escaped to India because of religious persecution. And of course, such persecution existed. Look at the population numbers of Hindus or Sikhs in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Bangladesh. Look at the temples there. Look at the plight of Hindu women there. But then somehow, none of this reality even registered on the minds of our friends. There was just one fundamental moral crime that had been committed by the Indian government in their eyes. Religious discrimination had now been legalized. Now, that is a criticism and an argument that could have been made with merit and reason once upon a time long ago. Maybe. But when propaganda captures a society, the issue is no longer about facts and logic, is it? I've been studying the literature on propaganda for many years now. It's no surprise that this has been a concern of some of the most creative and perceptive minds in the West. In India, we simply haven't invested enough in understanding propaganda as a phenomenon because perhaps we think it has not affected us that much. I'm not saying we are naive or ignorant about it, not at all. In the last few years, there's been so much written, so many YouTube videos and talks and podcasts on Indian history, politics, how a cabal of pseudo-intellectuals and political dynasts systematically lied to us and enshrined those lies as truth in textbooks, monuments, museums, everywhere. We are living in a phenomenal period of truth-seeking, research, communication, networking, and knowledge-making. I think all that is great. But still, there is so much happening to us today that we cannot make sense of because we don't really have the intellectual tools for it. I think that propaganda is one such phenomenon, and the explosion of a certain kind of mass behavior around the absolute false claims about the CAA was and still remains a signature example of that phenomenon. We have a saying in India: we can wake up someone who's sleeping, but not someone who's pretending to be sleeping. Now the situation is even more complicated. When you say someone is pretending, you're giving them some agency and choice. But what do you do in reality when facts are simply not having the effect on them as they are on you? Do you keep arguing? Maybe blocking your friends on social media? What if these are your family, your children, your co-workers, or your boss? How will you survive the new age of propaganda that runs through the intrusive systems of technology and surveillance that are our smartphones? Can you just keep your head down and convictions and your truths private? Just like work-life balance, work out some kind of truth to propaganda balance maybe? I think not. Because the nature of the persuasion that has been unleashed now is such that you will not be left alone. You cannot ask to be left alone. You will have to demonstrate or else be called a Nazi enabler. You will have to agree, as Winston Smith, the long-suffering hero of George Orwell's 1984 does, that 2 plus 2 is not 4 but 5. You see, dear friends, propaganda is not new, nor is the study of propaganda new either. But then, even as we take some pride in India's achievements or feel concerned about some of its current directions, we have to start talking about the fact that the modern world exists in a condition of propaganda. In earlier times, in earlier generations, before we had smartphones and the constant temptations of social media, the incessant urge to stick our heads out into incoming traffic from utter strangers, maybe it did not matter as much. But now, in 2024, as we look back on the dark winter of 2019-2020, where lies spread like viruses even before the actual virus came, and death and suffering visited so many innocent people, we must be vigilant to reality. That reality is less about the details, less about exactly what CAA or some other policy is or isn't. It is the basic physical reality that here we are, standing upright after millions of years of evolution, exercising intelligence and motor skills and incredible cultural inheritances from our ancestors, like our languages, to exhibit incredibly unnecessary, hurtful, unreasonable, and yes, untruthful conduct towards each other. Satyam Jnanam Anantam Brahma. May these be the words we live by again.